The economic crisis gripping Russia is no longer a matter of abstract forecasting. It is a brutal, measurable reality that has already begun, confirming that the cost of Vladimir Putin's war is now manifesting as the structural disintegration of the civilian economy. The consensus among even state-aligned financial analysts indicates that a full-scale recession in 2026 is now an inescapable certainty, a collapse that is being actively accelerated by the leadership's own disastrous fiscal policies. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare, global affairs, and US domestic politics. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. Also, please watch this video to the very end, even if you play it in the background without sound, as your continuous viewing is critical to help promote the truth about the war. The depth of this catastrophe is confirmed by the fundamental statistics of the national economy. The state's economic managers may talk of a soft landing, but the reality is a steep, immediate downturn. Currently, nearly 1/3 of all Russian companies are operating at a loss, a negative trend that has accelerated sharply and already surpassed the worst metrics seen during the COVID-19 pandemic. This structural shift, where financial distress is rampant, proves that the state's military-first spending is creating a profound financial imbalance that the real sector cannot sustain. This high proportion of unprofitable businesses signals a deep fiscal rot that will soon convert into mass unemployment and industrial failure. The crisis is not confined to obscure markets. It is consuming key, systemically important industries. The agricultural machinery sector, a vital domestic supplier, is collapsing, with sales and production falling by up to 30%. This is the worst operational performance for that industry in over 2 decades, a direct result of high interest rates and falling demand from debt-laden farmers. Similarly, the construction and materials sector, a traditionally massive employer, is facing catastrophic decline, evidenced by the sharp drop in demand for basic materials like bricks and cement. Even the core of Russian manufacturing is suffering. AutoVAZ, a symbol of domestic industry, is operating on a 4-day workweek, and Uralvagonzavod, a producer of military vehicles, has been forced to cut shifts for its civilian operations. These actions confirm that the massive government spending on weapons cannot compensate for the simultaneous collapse of civilian demand and the unaffordability of credit. The strategic failure is that the state is actively engaged in cannibalizing its own productive base. The trillions of rubles poured into the military budget are starving the civilian sector of capital, credit, and resources, leading to a profound, self-inflicted industrial contraction. The lack of investment, coupled with high interest rates designed to fight budget-driven inflation, are driving profitable companies into insolvency. This failure to maintain the civilian economy means that the state is undermining its long-term financial capacity. The economic crisis is no longer a risk. It is an active, structural disintegration that confirms the unsustainability of the war.
We have established the structural collapse of Russia's industrial base. Now we confront the immediate, painful consequence of that failure, a devastating inflationary storm that is actively driving down the standard of living and signaling the approach of a severe social crisis. This inflation is not a statistical anomaly. It is the direct, brutal result of the government's choice to prioritize war financing over the economic well-being of its citizens. The quantitative evidence of this shock is undeniable. Inflation has settled into an unacceptably high and sustained trajectory, with weekly price increases running at over 0.22% for multiple consecutive weeks. This rate, fueled by the vast, uncontrolled injection of money into the system to cover military deficits, confirms that the central bank has lost its battle for price stability. This is not temporary volatility. This is the new, corrosive reality of a war economy. The crisis is visible in 2 critical areas of consumer expenditure. First, fuel costs continue to impose an immense inflationary tax on the entire economy. The price of gasoline, which has soared by over 10% this year, feeds directly into the cost of all goods, compounding the inflationary effect across the entire supply chain. Second, the cost of basic foodstuffs, the essential items that constitute the daily diet of the average Russian family, is skyrocketing. The temporary relief offered by the summer harvest is over. Prices for vegetables and fresh produce are accelerating rapidly as the reality of insufficient domestic supply sets in. This broad inflation across fuel, staples, and services confirms that the pressure is systemic, directly linked to the excessive budgetary spending on the conflict. The most damning proof of the approaching social crisis lies in the profound change in consumer behavior. The Russian populace is no longer buying for convenience. They are being forced into a savings model of consumption due to drastically reduced purchasing power. Evidence shows that demand for basic, nutritious foodstuffs has collapsed. Consumption of dairy products has plummeted, with sales volumes of butter falling by over 11%. This reduction in purchasing is not discretionary. It is a necessity imposed by soaring prices. When the cost of milk and butter, foundational components of a balanced diet, particularly for children, becomes prohibitive, it is the clearest sign that household budgets are failing. This decline in the standard of living directly threatens the political stability of the regime. The state relies on a passive, compliant population, but historically, the hunger of the populace is the most potent catalyst for unrest. As wages fail to keep pace with soaring prices, and as essential goods become luxuries, the social contract breaks down. The economic crisis is no longer confined to the balance sheets of corporations. It is impacting the nutritional security of families, a volatile reality that the ruling elite is desperately trying to mask, but is structurally incapable of reversing.
We have established the immediate, painful reality of the consumer crisis and soaring inflation. Now we confront the structural engine driving this collapse, the profound, lethal convergence of the domestic fuel crisis and the national budgetary deficit. This is a destructive feedback loop where the state's inability to fund the war is compelling it to adopt fiscal policies that guarantee economic ruin. The financial pressure is immense and escalating. The government is struggling under a record budget deficit, a colossal financial hole created by the massive military expenditure required to sustain the war against Ukraine. This deficit has reached crisis levels and is now colliding with the fuel crisis. The soaring price of gasoline, which has risen by over 10% in a year and continues to climb. This dual crisis leaves the Kremlin with no conventional financial options. The state can neither borrow its way out of the deficit nor print its way out. This strategic dilemma has forced the government into a stance of fiscal brutality, a policy of aggressive extraction aimed directly at the populace and the productive sectors of the economy. The most visible manifestation of this cruelty is the planned tax hike, specifically the proposed increase of the VAT to 22%. This is a political and economic act of desperation. The government is effectively admitting that it can no longer generate revenue through growth, so it must seize money through taxation. This tax increase is immediately and systematically compounding the inflationary crisis. By hiking taxes, the state triggers a cascade of price increases across all industries, ensuring that the burden of the deficit is transferred directly onto the final consumer, thereby accelerating the impoverishment of the average citizen. This financial cannibalism extends to the most politically sensitive areas, the army itself. Faced with massive regional budget shortfalls, which the federal center is refusing to cover, local authorities in major, systemically important regions like St. Petersburg and Tatarstan have been forced into the humiliating and destructive act of slashing the one-time payouts offered to military contract recruits. This synchronized action across the Federation is a clear signal. The state can no longer afford its own volunteer army. This move destroys morale, damages the recruitment narrative, and proves that the financial pressure of the war is overwhelming even the most critical military necessity. The consequence of this aggressive, self-destructive fiscal strategy is the guarantee of further economic chaos. The increased taxation chokes off what little entrepreneurial activity remains in the civilian sector, while the continuous funding of the military continues to flood the system with unbacked cash. This structural contradiction ensures that the war will continue to accelerate the economic and financial collapse, making the entire war effort structurally and financially unsustainable for Putin.
We have analyzed the external financial pressures and the internal crises of inflation and debt. Now we confront the most devastating internal military consequence, the collapse of the military-industrial complex. This is not merely an economic slowdown, it is a profound strategic failure that proves the Russian military economy cannot sustain its ambitions indefinitely. The war machine has reached a structural dead end, and the system is stalling. The primary shockwave is visible in the production numbers. Official data from September confirms that growth in defense-related industrial output has stalled to near zero or has tipped into the negative. This is an unprecedented development. For nearly 3 years, the only sector that provided any positive economic signal for the Russian state was the military one, bloated by trillions of rubles in government orders. Now, that primary engine has sputtered and died. The production of essential ready metal product has declined, and the output growth for combat vehicles and transport has slowed drastically. This means the military is losing its capacity to replenish the tanks, armored personnel carriers, and missile stockpiles being consumed on the front lines, effectively guaranteeing that the war of attrition is unwinnable. This critical stall is not due to a saturation of the army's needs. It is the direct result of an insolvable financial hunger that is choking the MIC. The massive federal deficit, which the government cannot close through reliable borrowing, has created a funding crisis. The state is unable to provide the necessary capital injection to its defense sector. This lack of cash is exacerbated by the financial market, the central bank's cripplingly high interest rate, while intended to fight inflation, simultaneously chokes off all affordable credit for the defense industry. Defense plants cannot secure the cheap loans they need to finance long-term, high-volume production of raw materials and specialized components. The MIC is caught in an unholy paradox. It has unlimited demand from the state, but zero affordable capital to fulfill the orders. This financial starvation is compounded by deep systemic corruption and inefficiency. Decades of institutionalized malfeasance mean that the sector is structurally incapable of operating efficiently, even with massive funding. State defense corporations are notorious for overstating costs and under-delivering product. They are vast bureaucratic black holes that consume immense resources, but fail to translate them into effective, high-volume combat assets. This internal rot ensures that the money that is allocated is wasted. The result is a military that is technologically reliant on imported components, financially reliant on a dysfunctional state, and operationally reliant on an industrial base that is slowing to a standstill. The implications of this industrial collapse are profound and long-lasting. The stall in production means that the Russian army will enter the next fighting season with fewer available assets and less effective fire support. This validates the strategic analyses of the Z-bloggers who are now sounding the alarm. The super crisis is not just imminent, it is here. The structural inability to maintain production growth is a direct, quantifiable indicator that the war of attrition is unwinnable. The system has failed its core mission, confirming that the ultimate cost of this conflict is the destruction of the Russian state's primary means of projecting power.
We have meticulously analyzed the systemic failures consuming the Russian state, the industrial collapse, the inflationary shock, and the fiscal crisis. Now, we deliver the final, unavoidable verdict. The totality of these crises confirms that the war effort is structurally insolvent, and the economic dead end is the decisive factor that will ultimately compel Vladimir Putin to cease aggression. The central truth is that all crises are converging into a single, terminal threat that the central bank and the government are powerless to resolve. The military's immense spending requirements have created a persistent, unmanageable budget deficit. This deficit has driven rampant inflation and a destabilizing fiscal environment. To fight this chaos, the central bank is forced into a strategic corner. Its only viable tool is to maintain a cripplingly high key interest rate. This rate, currently soaring, is the very instrument that is actively destroying the civilian economy. It chokes off all investment and credit, pushing profitable businesses into insolvency, leading to mass unemployment and guaranteeing the contraction of the domestic economy. The system is now trapped in a profound and fatal feedback loop. The war demands spending. The spending causes inflation. Inflation forces the high interest rate, and the high rate destroys the productive economy. This structural insolvency is amplified by the external pressures, the fuel collapse caused by kinetic sanctions, and the global isolation that prevents Russia from financing its debt. The state is structurally incapable of reversing this trend because the actions required to stabilize the ruble, maintaining high rates, are the same actions that accelerate the collapse of industry, strangling investment. This economic disintegration is the ultimate mechanism of defeat. The Kremlin can no longer rely on the sheer momentum of its economy to outlast its adversaries. The political and military leadership will be forced to confront the reality that they are rapidly running out of the financial and industrial capacity to sustain the war. The total collapse of the civilian industrial base, coupled with the systemic failure to manage inflation, guarantees that the conflict is moving toward an end dictated by financial necessity. The final consequence of this war of choice will be a forced surrender accelerated by the unsurmountable economic debt incurred by the Russian state.